Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Andrew Harrison. On today's show, Rishi Sunak cuts a desperate figure at PMQs these days, and he's losing his marbles, yes, nobody's said that before, over petty diplomatic issues. How do we get through the final months of a dog-end administration? Plus, the Israel-Hamas crisis has politicians and commentators treading on eggshells when it comes to the intersection of religion and politics. Why does British politics find it so hard to deal with religion? Let's say hello to the panel. Ros Taylor is a journalist and author of the forthcoming book, The Future of Trust. Hello, Ros.
Hello, Andrew.
So last week we had the very sad news that the former Chancellor Alistair Darling passed away. He was only 70. Gordon Brown gets a lot of credit for saving the world from financial disaster in the crisis. Does Darling get the credit he deserves?
Probably not, no. I don't think he really wanted it, though. I mean, he didn't want to be leader. And, when you don't want to be leader and you're not jostling for that kind of power the whole time, you just tend to get ignored. And it's true. I mean, having written about politics during that period, we just didn't pay enough, didn't pay enough attention to Darling and what he was doing and what he was saying. But he was quietly a very effective man. And, he went on his own political journey. Apparently, I was reading this morning that when Kinnock first met him in Scotland, when he was a young campaigner, he said, "I never want to see that bearded trot becoming an MP." And it's true. He had this amazing beard, which he later kind of cut down to a more respectable beard, which unfortunately made him look a bit like the Master in Doctor Who.
There's nothing wrong with that. I am usually referred to as the Darling.
And then he shaved it off reputedly because Tony and Gordon told him to.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But yes, he achieved a lot, and we could talk for a long time in a more sensible way about his expertise in the financial sphere.
I just remember him being enormously likeable and discussed at the time as if he was a kind of a bit part player in the background, even though he held very senior offices. And compared to the cast of characters now, he looks like an absolute titan.
Yeah, exactly.
I also like the fact that when he was moved from trade and industry to Chancellor, the splash on the Standard was "Move over, darling."
Yes.
Very
well,
endless
opportunities for puns there.
Absolutely. Back on the pod, it's Yasmin Sahan, staff writer at Time magazine. Hello, Yasmin.
Hey, Andrew.
So Reuters has reported that the Biden administration has told Israel that the US is going to impose visa bans on extremist Israeli settlers who are found to have committed acts of violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. Is this a significant shift in Washington's attitude, or is it just a kind of a symbolic thing, do you think?
I don't think it marks a significant shift. I think it's a relatively easy way for the Biden administration to register its disapproval of the rising Israeli settler violence targeting Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. This violence, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, has been surging under the cover of war, and the Israeli military has been unable or seemingly unwilling to put a stop to it. In terms of U.S. policy and the Biden administration's policy, it's long, voiced an opposition to Israeli settlement expansion, but it really hasn't exercised much leverage to curb it. And the violence that we're seeing, in the West Bank, one of, dispossession, displacement, unfortunately, many have been killed, it's part and parcel of that expansion. I believe the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din has counted at least 225 incidents of settler violence in 93 Palestinian communities since the war began. And this year, according to the UN, was already on track to be the deadliest year for Palestinians since it started counting in 2006. And of course, that was just in the West Bank. But now with Gaza, of course, that's bound to be true there as well. So, barring a few extremist settlers from traveling to the U.S., I think it has symbolic value, but is it going to change much on the ground? I don't think so.
We're going to be returning to this a little bit later in the podcast. We're really pleased to welcome back to the podcast, friend of the pod, Times columnist and Times Radio regular, Hugo Rifkind. Hi, Hugo.
Hello.
So the BBC and Newsnight is going to be cut down to half an hour. It's going to lose its documentary report. It's going to lose 34 journalists. It's going to become little more than a podcast. Nothing wrong with that. This is following kind of massive cuts to the BBC's local radio output as well. Is the government finally getting its wish of a fully denatured, disempowered BBC?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Look, the thing that always does my head in about the BBC is it has two modes. It can either massively overstaff everything to a ridiculous degree that has other sort of media organisations holding their heads in sort of jealous horror, or it can just kill everything and ruin it and make it tiny and small. I'm sure there was some middle ground for Newsnight where it remained a functioning entity without being sort of about as well staffed as like Sky News altogether.
Yeah.
But it didn't seem to manage to do it. I mean, the extent to which it's the government's sort of fault. Well, it's certainly the government's will. The extent to which it's the government's fault, I'm not sure. I mean, the BBC's been wrestling with cuts for a while. If they choose to pump their money into other things rather than Newsnight, I guess that's sort of the BBC's lookout, really.
Yeah, it's kind of an arm's length thing, isn't it, really? Because the BBC has had real terms cuts for such a long period of time, and then the government can turn around and say, look at the terrible decisions they're making. Nothing to do with us, Gov.
Yeah, absolutely. But, again, I mean, sitting here on a podcast, I don't need to tell you how different most media operations are from the BBC in the ways they manage to staff things. That being said, the work I do with the BBC, the producer count has dropped significantly over the last 5 years, I would say. Sometimes you've only got one these days.
Only one?
Only one on a whole show.
We've only got half a producer.
Well, there you go.
Mind you, these gold chairs won't pay for themselves.
Before we get into the main topics, some news. We are really looking forward to the Oh God, What Now Christmas show next Wednesday, the 13th of December at the Comedy Store in London. It's sold out, but if you didn't get a ticket or if you live outside London, we are streaming the show live for Patreon backers. Just search Patreon Oh God, What Now, sign up, and you'll get the link to watch the show live and video of the show afterwards to watch at your leisure. So you can treat the family to me, Dorian, Alex and special guest James O'Brien on Christmas Day instead of Elf or the Guns of Navarone. There's no accounting of taste, really, is there? Also, we're using the Comedy Store's fancy audio-visual kit instead of Zoom, so you will get much better picture and audio quality. Sign up now and we'll see you on the night.
I love the idea of a family gathered around watching you answer questions about potentially rejoining the European Union.
I'm going to have to wear my extra big sparkly earrings.
Excellent.
Yeah.
What the people want.
Could you actually get Elf on the podcast? That'd be amazing.
Yes. Well, that was a special guest. You've ruined it now. Thanks for that. Cheers, Hugo. First this week, like a useless boss who you know is leaving in a month's time, but everybody has to pretend that they're still in charge, the Sunak government can't stop with the pointless attempts to make itself look relevant. Last week, it was Rishi Sunak picking a pointless fight with the Greek Prime Minister over the Parthenon marbles. Has any other Prime Minister ever been trolled by a king with a special tie? This week, it's deciding to raise the base entry level for migrants because care home workers can all easily earn £35,000 and also putting the boot into the BBC licence fee again. The dial of public opinion is not moving. Labour's 20-point poll lead seems apparently solid, but we could be in for months of this. If these are the dog days of a government that's finally run out of road, how are we going to get through them and the long months before they're kicked out? I mean, Ros, governments do run out of steam and they kind of enter the cycle of relaunch after relaunch. Sunak's gone from the motorist's friend to the change candidate to we're bringing the noughties back in a period of about 8 weeks. Can voters smell that kind of uncertainty, the smell of death?
Yeah, I think they can. And he's not really doing anything to allay it, which is what is really surprising me. I mean, he was asked a couple of days ago if there was a possibility that Nigel Farage could rejoin the Conservative Party. And he basically said, maybe. Why would you do that? This is like inviting entryism. I mean, he hasn't even got the confidence in his own party to rule out a bloke who thinks eating insects on TV will make him a contender for Prime Minister. He could easily just say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Or, no. But no, he just kind of said, oh, it's a broad church, the Conservative Party. God, it's insane. And so there's no sense right now of what the party is and what it stands for. There's just a sense of what it doesn't stand for. It doesn't stand for small boats. It doesn't stand for inflation. It's like watching a man whose house is falling down, like running from small DIY job to small DIY job, but each of them actually makes everything much worse. And he's so bad at it. And there's also a feeling that the party itself is falling apart. I mean, there's rumours now that more Tory MPs are thinking of leaving after Christmas. That will weaken the kind of party's institutional heft. And entities like Newcon is lining up and trying to establish what the party might possibly be post-defeat. It's not a healthy place to be.
Some of these ideas, like I mentioned, raising the migrant salary base, which just seems to be something that the right of the party has demanded, irrespective of making sense. And Sunak's just got, all right then, cutting provoking another fight with the BBC, selling off the HS2 land so that the next government can't reverse the decision. They all feel like gratuitous moves to just bind or hamper the next government. like salting the earth because the Conservatives know they can't win. Do you think that is the case?
Yeah, it's actually slightly worse than that. Well, it's a lot worse than that. I mean, the whole autumn statement was about kicking the more money that the public services desperately need because of inflation, kicking that down the road to the mid-2020s. The BBC licence fee, they want to keep the inflationary increase down this year, but next year it's going to pop up again. It's scaling back health and social care visas and the minimum wage. It's all going to be problems that Labour potentially is going to have to deal with, not the Conservatives. And so they've really clocked that Labour is determined to stick to the Tories' spending plans, and they are now saying, well, we're going to make a virtue out of that. We're going to make sure that's as difficult as possible.
How
for them
about
to do.
no money spent on anything ever? Would you stick with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even the industrial disputes, there's no deal with ASLEF yet. It's just kick it down the road a few more months, make Labour deal with it.
Yeah. Hugo, there is a real sort of semi-anarchic end-of-term feel at this. The exams have been done, the teachers don't care anymore, and the kids are running riot. Do you get the sense that the Conservative Party is mentally checked out?
No, not at all. I think they think they're in it to win it, but it's just it's bonkers because I mean, everyone can see, the dogs in the street can see that they're about to lose an election from the centre, like Tories always do. Whenever Tories lose an election, it's from the centre, and the way Rishi Sunak is dealing with that is by throwing out more and more policies to the right. He's basically got the right. It's really, really weird. He once seems to be incredibly worried that the country doesn't like him as much as he would like them to, whereas at the same time seems to perceive the country as full of people who are really going to like this Elgin Marble stuff, and really want a bit of sort of clear blue water against Keir Starmer. No matter that, actually, the reason why Keir Starmer is doing so well is because he's making such inroads into the centre. This is obvious. This is obvious to everyone. It almost looked for a moment when he brought back David Cameron that he was that this was a flick to the centre. This did have the sort of the blue wall in mind. That this was a let's return to the supposed competence of the early 2000s. I think that's not even why he brought him back. I think David Lammy was right that he did bring him back because he literally couldn't think of anybody else. There wasn't one MP who could have done the job. So that's very odd. But at the same time, I mean, Tories, they do often before election defeats exist in denial. They were in plenty of denial pre-1997. And I mean, there is a strong feeling among Conservatives, maybe, just maybe, the economy picks up, and this is actually 1992. Maybe the country finally sees Keir Starmer for who he is, this dangerous radical, I mean, this is, I wouldn't say this is widely believed, but it is believed. So no, I don't think they've given up. I don't think they ever give up.
I just love the idea of supposed competence as a slogan for the next election. I think you come up with an absolute winner there. I mean, you're right that there is a lot of kind of evidence to imagine that they are in it to win it. Not least, here's Isaac Levido with the battle plan, sort of animating everybody for a supposed election in May. But to what extent is that just believed in the hardcore, or does the wider Tory party really believe it, do you think?
Well, I mean, what's strange is that the wider Tory party is sort of madder than the central Tory party, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So the wider party is sort of much more extreme. The wider party is more likely to believe that they're going to win the next election than I'd imagine Rishi Sunak is. So, I mean, and actually it's the wider Tory party that does believe that they need to go further to the right and does believe there is somehow this mythical body of the electorate that they haven't managed to tap so far that still exists there. I mean, I don't... Look, I mean, they're not going to get rid of Rishi Sunak before the next election. Because...
You've said it now.
I know I've said it now. But
that's going to haunt you.
I was going to say, because that would be mad. But, so many mad things. But, I really don't think they are. There was this fascinating moment after the local elections where Jacob Rees-Mogg said, now it's time to get behind Rishi Sunak, and then literally didn't say anything for the next year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do think when the election starts to loom, there will be a bit less friendly fire and a bit more kind of sort of, cross-party fighting. But it's, I mean, you can... how much meaning can you sort of discern in the sort of staggering ravings of mad people? Yeah,
it's kind of like the whole thing has passed the event horizon and the laws of physics are breaking down, but we're trying to kind of understand them with the conventional laws of physics, which don't really work anymore.
Yeah, you can't predict where the dog's going to run. He's got rabies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ros, I mean, it's one thing opposing an active government with a coherent programme that you hate. But how do Labour and how do voters and how do people like us keep our energies up when you're basically kind of kicking this dead body around like, the Simpsons meme, stop, he's already dead. And it's going to go on and on and on. How do we kind of keep our not just think of the podcasters, but how do we keep our kind of momentum up while we're up against this kind of flaccid jelly?
Yeah, I mean, I prefer zombie metaphor myself. I'm not sure kicking the dead body. Anyway, let's move. Seriously, though, I mean, I think the problem we've got now is, and the thing everyone is asking, well, when Labour comes to power, assuming Labour does come to power, how is it going to be better? The next Labour government already feels like austerity redux, and we're not even, they're not even elected yet. And they've somehow got to sort of lift the mood without bringing the booze, if you see what I mean.
Bringing the booing, because bringing the booze is going to be the only way to get through it.
But once they come to power, they've got to very quickly turn around this broken Britain stagnation nation narrative that you keep hearing all the time. And that is going to be really hard. And as we have all said many times, it's going to be really hard without any injection of money. So I reckon they have something massive up their sleeve, but I can't think what it is. And they're certainly not going to tell us whatever the hell it is before the election. Yeah,
well, I mean, Labour campaigning does seem to be cancelling things that have been previously announced, doesn't it? Hugo?
I don't think it's going to be that hard for them. I think it's going to be fine. They're going to be like, I mean, the whole pitch is like, we're like the other lot, but not shit. And I think they're going to do that just fine. And I think a year will go past, they won't have done much, and everyone will still be like, this is better.
Britain will still be shit, won't it? I mean, that's the problem.
But I mean, some things are inevitable. But I mean, I think the way Labour. I was going to say the way Labour loses the election. Labour's not going to lose the election. The way Labour struggles in the election is by being bold, is by announcing things, is by having policies, is by promising radical change. People have had enough of radical change. They'll want it again in a bit, but for now, no radical change, please.
Let me tell you a little story about a guy called Jeremy Corbyn with some crazy ideas, some wild ideas. Yasmin, I mean, you've been a bit neglected from this conversation because none of this is your fault. You're an American citizen. You got clean hands.
I've been enjoying it. Don't worry.
Well, I wanted to ask you, the US as the phenomenon of the lame duck president, the one who can't stand again, and all the political action has moved either to the upcoming election or to the next front runner. I mean, in your experience, from this side of the Atlantic, it drags the energy out of politics. What's been your experience of that phase of government?
I mean, I think it really depends, to be honest. In one sense, you're absolutely right. Lame duck administrations kind of run out of steam once people feel, or I guess once they're no longer seen as having, any political viability or, the ability to make change. But by that same token, lame ducks, in a way are also kind of free to take up whatever action they like without the pressure of trying to retain power or popularity. I mean, recall Donald Trump, he did quite a lot of damage between losing his reelection bid in November and ceding power to Joe Biden in January. So, and I think there have been examples of past, different presidents kind of take it different ways. I think what's so striking and so different about the US and UK kind of systems is that, the UK has a lot more suspense. It's a lot more exciting. We don't know when your election's going to happen. A prime minister has one bad week and they could be gone. Whereas with the US, it's a bit more rigid. I mean, barring an impeachment. And even then, we kind of just do those for fun now.
Yeah, that doesn't work anymore.
It doesn't really, no. There's not, we know when our next election's coming and people kind of just wait for that. And I think what makes the political system in the US tolerable in the interim is that it constantly feels like we're in campaign mode. I mean, when we're not having a midterms, we're having a presidential, and the campaigning period between those two is quite big. So I think that's how we kind of manage it.
Who's the last president who was absolutely nailed on to lose? Can we cast our minds back? Do we, because, even Trump looked like, I remember on the night when it was called, just feeling a great weight leave me, like an evil spirit had been expelled from my body. I'm trying to look back, and obviously Bush 2 was kind of leaving power anyway. But did we feel that John McCain was absolutely doomed, and you knew what a new phase was on its way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bush is actually a really good example, and I actually went back and tried to reread some of the coverage from that period because I think I would have been in elementary school at the time, so I wasn't kind of keeping up with politics as well as I try to do so
That's
now.
No excuse.
Yeah, no. But there was a Guardian article actually that was written in May 2008, so still a good 6 months before the election that would determine who his successor was, and it described him as fast becoming the forgotten man of America's political landscape. This is how they describe the president. And to put, he still had quite a bit of time left. But to put that really harsh verdict into context, Bush's domestic agenda was defeated by the Democrats who controlled Congress. His legacy was defined by the disastrous nature of the Iraq War. His popularity had plunged. Compare that with someone like Obama. I mean, he kind of managed to avoid the lame duck label, in large part, I think, because he really ratcheted up his use of executive powers, even towards the tail end of his presidency. And perhaps that was also because he had a sense, even though we were all expecting a Clinton victory, that it may not necessarily end up that way, and that he had to kind of shore up as much as he could.
It's part of it, and I know this is like very hard to quantify, it's part of it just vibe. I mean, even when Obama was leaving, he never looked like a loser. And even when Rishi Sunak was swanning in, he's always, he never looked like a winner. He's almost looked like a kind of a desperate middle manager guy who his boss has died and suddenly it's like, shit, I'm in charge. And I've just got to kind of say, guys, it's going to be great.
That's the thing. I think if you're a two-term American president, you kind of get to ride out the full 2 terms, again, barring some weird impeachment scandal that gets you booted from office, but that doesn't happen very often. So you kind of get to frame your time in office as, this is what I was able to achieve in 8 years, if you're lucky. Whereas with British prime ministers, it kind of just feels like, to whatever extent you're allowed to control how you exit. I mean, obviously Liz Truss controlled her resignation, but there was no way she was ever going to make that look like it was a success. So yeah, they're very different systems. I mean, I think I find the British one quite fun. Keeps you on your toes.
Well, it's easy for you to say. Jesus, been stuck with it forever. Ros, like me, you can remember the dying days of the major governments, crazy times of the Cones hotline and stuff like that. Is this as bad? Is it worse?
Oh, it's much worse. Much worse. I mean, I was 21 back then at the time of that election. So, everything looks different when you're 21. And clearly I wasn't sitting in a podcast talking about politics back then either. But there was a sense that the country had sort of pulled out of the worst of the Black Wednesday sterling crisis, and it was beginning to be on the up. In other words, the Tories were kind of not the right party for the time because they weren't echoing a kind of dynamism that I think was beginning, and maybe it was just as I say because I was 21. There was a feeling the country was more dynamic at the time. Now there is very little sense, if at all, of bottled up potential bursting to be let out. And maybe Hugo, I don't know, you were about the same age at the time, I imagine.
I mean, my attitude towards the major government was slightly complicated by my father being part of it.
Well, yeah.
So my views were perhaps not typical. But I was looking back today. Look, firstly, I'd say it's not 1997. It's 1992. It's just 1992 that's going to go differently because, as you say, there isn't that wave of optimism in the country, either about the Labour Party or in general, because we were sort of pulling out of the recession in '97. Things were on the up. Britpop had already really happened.
Absolutely, Park Life was all
that stuff. There was the way the country was, and there was the government, and they just didn't match at all. All that being said, looking back at exactly how bad all the scandals of the major government was, my God, I sort of remembered all the back to basics stuff as being 2 or 3 people. You look through even the Wikipedia entry, it goes on for pages and pages.
Of them.
There's the ones you remember. There's the David Mellors. There's Piers Merchant, who I'd forgotten all about, who had an affair with a Soho hostess. There's some Norman Lamont having a sex therapist in his flat. Forgotten that.
I thought that was a headline from the Day Today. Norman Lamont, sex therapist.
No, it actually happened.
Yeah,
he rented out a flat to a sex therapist. Why this was a scandal, I'm not sure.
Who was the guy with the Satsuma and the amyl nitrates?
Oh, he died.
That was very sad.
That was
very sad.
Milligan. Yeah. But there were also other names. Gary Waller, Rod Richards. Who they?
You're making these up.
They just had affairs. I mean, you could say there's pages and pages and pages, and you sort of see the extent to which actually it was a government just sort of teetering and collapsing in every way.
Wasn't Jonathan Aiken in this time as well?
Yes.
Incredible.
Yeah, they all were. There was, literally, between 93 and 96 was when the bulk of it. There were, 16, 17 Tory scandals, and all proper ones.
What? Proper ones, not
proper
rubbish ones.
Not the ones you get today.
That to young people.
Not just lying to the house about having a party. This was your proper sex therapist in the basement.
There was a different definition of scandal back then, though. I think it was more serious when you had affairs. And once Boris Johnson came along, I think all that changed. And almost anything was permissible.
Yes.
The problem now is if you actually watch your tractor porn in the Commons as opposed to just watching tractor porn per se.
I mean, back then, if you're going to watch tractor porn in the Commons, you'd have had to bring in a whole monitor and a VCR. It'd be quite the setup.
You have to go and bring it in on paper.
Bring in the actual tractor.
It might be, absolutely. I've got a copy of Tractor Loaded or something like that. One thing as well I'd completely forgotten from the major years was the dying major years was the mad cow disease outbreak, which is a strange analogue of the pandemic. It just comes in like a wrecking ball, and the government absolutely has no idea of how to handle it. Hugo, compared to 1996, this Labour Party is less impressive than the one that's coming in. But these Tories are kind of more embarrassing, more kind of feeble. Do you think that is this producing perhaps a kind of worn outness amongst voters that's going to be difficult for Labour next year?
I mean, maybe the dynamic's very different because, people come and go in politics a lot quicker. So the people you had at the top of Labour then, they'd all been around for a long time. Tony Blair had been around for a long time. Gordon Brown had been around for a long time. How long's Keir Starmer been an MP now? Is it 5-6 years? It's not that long.
Did it come in 2015? Was it?
Well, there you go. It's not like you had Brown, you had Darling, you had Robin Kirk. These people had all been there for really the better part of a generation. But meanwhile, over with the Tories at the moment, the problems with authority that Rishi Sunak has are literally because he's not meant to be there.
Yeah.
David Cameron's meant to still be the Prime Minister, bizarre as it might seem. Pretty much. If he'd run another term, which he could have done. Or perhaps George Osborne. Or that's the way the trajectory was going. They've all just fallen by the wayside. Rishi Sunak, he's never won an election. He's never won an internal party election. So if he looks like an imposter, that's because his party regards him as one. And you had the great sort of post-Brexit purges of anybody non-mad at the top of the Conservative Party simply because mad people didn't want to be a part of it. Loyalty towards Boris Johnson was, first there was loyalty to Brexit, and then there was loyalty towards Boris Johnson. And most reputable people simply wouldn't stick around to do that, even to the extent of that's why David Cameron has to be brought back to the Lords because he'd walked out because he couldn't be a part of that. So you do have this these people. It's not just a coincidence that they're sort of pygmies. They're only there because they're pygmies. Otherwise they'd have been booted out.
Yeah. Yasmin, just to wrap up this session on how we put up with the strange year that's coming ahead, does our government's ability to drag its time out, you kind of touched on this earlier, we can choose our own time. You said it's much more fun. But, it must look exceptionally weird to you, this idea that the process of politics and the process of government somebody can just put their finger on the pause button until either it suits them or until it's just far, far too late.
Yeah, I go back and forth between thinking it's frustrating and thinking that, at least with the UK system, your governments are kind of beholden to public opinion in a way that perhaps the US system is more insulated from. I'm thinking purely off the basis of that. Yes, we're not going to have an election unless the Conservatives call one and are convinced that having one is a good idea. But it's a tricky one. Actually, I've just kind of convinced myself of the opposite argument. I was going to say, I was like, oh, wait, but if you think you're really in trouble, then you just, kind of stand your ground and hold out until the last possible moment. But I think there will come a point where, and I'm sure we'll see this more next year, where to whatever extent Labour, feels that it should call for an election and kind of apply more pressure, that it's going to be a lot more difficult to ignore those calls, lest they seem like they're running scared from an almost certain defeat. Now, whether Labour will be inclined to make those calls early, but perhaps not. Perhaps they want as much preparation, and perhaps they see that, the more time there is, the better it helps them. Because I think, as Hugo was saying, they don't really need to do much. They kind of just need to just hold firm and not have any sort of internal bust-ups that cause issues. But yeah, it's true. I think the anticipation issue here is what makes it worse, because we know it could happen technically at any time. But God, can you just imagine if we had to wait till January 2025? Another year of this would be intolerable.
Bring back the fixed term Parliament Act. Said absolutely nobody. Next up, time to choose our hero and our villain of the week. Each of the panel is going to make an impassioned case for their choice, and I will decide because this is a dictatorship. Hugo, let's start with you.
I'll start with my villain, I think. My villain is Sultan Al Jabar, who is the president of COP28 in Dubai.
He's
he
a
a villain?
bastard.
Well, he's the head of COP28, and he's also the head of the Abu Dhabi Oil and Gas Company. Is this a conflict of interest? I think yes. He thinks no. You might think. You could argue that it makes sense that he's there because he has been a sort of long-term voice for the greenification of the UAE's energy mix and so on. The UAE is also aiming for net zero, like us, by 2050. Well done them. With the small exception of all the oil they sell to the rest of the world, which the rest of the world, then sets fire to. So it's quite hard to be net zero with that. He, however, says, don't worry, it's not a problem because net zero doesn't require phasing out oil and gas. He wants us to. He says we can keep burning it. It's fine. He says there's no pathway towards net zero that doesn't involve still burning oil and gas, which is sort of so mad. It's quite hard to even take the piss out of. But it is. It's enlightening in that it shows. Because look, you've got this situation now where the technology for saving the planet in an environmental sense is steaming ahead. We are renewables are on the up. All that kind of stuff is really, really working out. And yet we see that actually the geopolitics is going to really, really fight hard against making it happen. And he's right in the middle of that. So he's my villain.
Okie doke. Who's your hero?
Stella Creasy is my hero.
Uh-huh.
She took a stalker to court and won, and she was stalked and harassed terribly by this man. He even went to the extent of reporting her to social services, so they'd take her kids away and that kind of thing. And so she took him to court in Leicestershire. He was convicted, and she's now running a campaign to allow people who've been smeared in this kind of way to expunge their records with local councils from social services and elsewhere. I think it's really admirable, mainly because lots of people get harassed and trolled and stalked, and they just sort of hunker down and wait for it to stop happening. And no, she fought it, and she's helped other people who are fighting it. And I'm really full of admiration.
Excellent. Strong cases there. Ros, how about yours?
Well, my hero is Neil Kinnock this week because I've interviewed him a few times and various times. He's had to time those interviews very carefully because he needed to get back to Glenys and look after her. And he was clearly absolutely devoted to her and absolutely devoted to her care. She had a carer as well, but their partnership was something very unusual and very special, and so. That's what I sort of shout out to poor Neil Kinnock this time. My villain is United Utilities, which is a water company. Now, obviously, Britain's water companies are generally not my favourite organisations, but United Utilities, it emerged this week, poured sewage into Windermere. And they were able to do that because of the lax rules, but they also, they tried to cover it up. They didn't call in the Environment Agency when they should have done, to monitor how much sewage they were putting into Windermere because they just, they were marking their own homework and they decided they didn't have to. It's egregious. It's egregious.
That's also very convincing. Yasmin, hero and villain.
So my hero is Motaz Aziza. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's a Palestinian photojournalist in Gaza who's been providing a pretty vital window into what life there is like right now in a way that I think the wider international media, which of course can't enter Gaza, has been unable to. And he posted a statement over the weekend as Israel's bombardment of the Strip steadily moves south. He issued a statement over the weekend saying that the phase of risking your life to show what is happening is now over, and the phase of trying to survive has started. So, I've been generally quite in awe of the journalists on the ground who are kind of, reporting in ways that, as much as journalists like myself from afar might like to, simply can't do. But I think we're reaching a moment, particularly as, more parts of Gaza that were meant to be safe are becoming unsafe, where we can no longer actually rely on these people as well, lest they continue to risk their lives to show us what's going on. So he's my hero. My villain, I think this is against the rules. I was going to say Spotify Wrapped just because I end up feeling bad every year because I use Spotify primarily for work music and I don't listen to anything interesting. So Beethoven was my top artist, which just feels not quite so cool. But I think I'll echo Hugo on Sultan Al Jabar, mostly because he also reportedly said that there is no science behind the demands to phase out fossil fuels. Hugo, apologies if you stated that as well. I think it was
No, not yet.
panic trying to figure out how to find a better villain than Spotify. But they've also had layoffs, so actually maybe they are a viable contender. But yeah, I think that just absurd. I mean, I was in Dubai earlier this year for a work event, and when I found out that they were going to host COP, immediately thought, but like, this place is just traffic ridden. Like, can you imagine journalists descending on Dubai? And I don't actually know if COP is specifically being held in Dubai or if it's another part of the UAE. But in any event, I was like, this just doesn't seem like the greatest match. But I'll endorse Hugo's choice whilst also saying that, Spotify Wrapped every year, embarrassing. That's my bill.
Okay. Right. Okay. Very, very tricky, this, because there's some good cases there. I think we're going to go for Hero, because much as Stella Creasy is a friend of the pod, he's done a wonderful thing. Much as Neil Kinnock is a friend of the pod, and we've had him on, and he's a top guy. I think we're going to give it to Yasmin's photojournalist simply for risking own skin in the pursuit of doing the job. And I'm afraid I'm also going to have to go with Hugo and Yasmin's choice, not just because I'm a people pleaser and I don't want to be bullied, but because the idea of having the same Sultan in charge of COP28 and massive production of petrochemicals is pretty villainous on a supervillain scale.
He was asked by The Guardian quite recently, they interviewed him, and they said, given that you're the UAE's chief environmentalist, presumably your ambition is to shut down the oil company you yourself run. And he said, no, why?
Well, I'm sure he can come here and accept his trophy. Next up, why is British politics so bad at doing God? When demonstrations around the Israel-Gaza crisis erupted in the UK last month, they brought debate about anti-Semitism back to the surface. On top of the controversy over the From the River to the Sea chant, some banners and placards were undoubtedly anti-Semitic. Counter-accusations of Islamophobia also came up, and politicians found it very hard to formulate consistent responses. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the MSP Kate Forbes' bid to succeed Nicola Sturgeon as SNP leader was badly hampered by her Christian beliefs, specifically her stance on gay marriage and Scotland's gender recognition legislation. Yet, in England, the new National Conservatives, centred around Miriam Cates, have religion at their very core. It is fair to say that British politics is uncomfortable with religion. Alistair Campbell famously told Blair, "We don't do God, but could we do it better?" Yasmin, when we were talking about this before the show, both you and Hugo were keen to emphasise that at its core, the Israel-Palestine dispute is territorial, and that the discourse tends to reduce it to a Jewish versus Muslim thing. But from the outside, when you're seeing a lot of clearly anti-Semitic rhetoric cloaked in it's anti-Zionism actually, and you can see clearly religious Jewish nationalist settlers, like we talked about earlier in the programme, it certainly looks very religious. How can we get anywhere on this when the distinction is so unclear?
Look, the confusion is understandable. I mean, after all, this is a conflict that is taking place in the Holy Land. It's involving Israel, the world's only Jewish state, supported by evangelical Christians in the US and elsewhere. And of course, you have the Palestinians, who are made up of both Muslims and Christians, I hasten to add, because my Palestinian Christian friends get really, really annoyed when we forget about them. But the religious framing, as you mentioned, is not, and I think it's really a reductive one, and one that I think only suits more often than not, the more extreme sort of corners of either side. What we have here is a territorial dispute in which two national identities are trying to lay claim to the same land. That's kind of, and I think when we frame it in religious tones, as people who I'd often, expect to know a bit better do, I don't think that helps. And I think it unfortunately drives a lot of the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia that we've seen in recent weeks, which is obviously abhorrent. But it's important to make that distinction clear. And, I say all of that while acknowledging that, for some people, religion plays a part in why they feel a particular need to either feel, a strong affinity with Israel or to feel an affinity with the Palestinians. But I think to frame it that way does a disservice to everyone there. I just think it's not really accurate.
Hamas definitely invokes militant Islamism, and it's committed in its charter, which we can talk about in a minute, to destroying Israel, which many people would say is anti-Semitic in itself. But you've pointed out that for many Palestinians, the kind of Hamas is in some respects the only thing on offer. They have a deep mistrust of the PLO, the one that the Palestinian Authority, the thing that preceded them. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because most of us are not seeing the subtleties of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think you brought up a lot of really interesting points there. I mean, I guess in terms of where to start, I think something that's always important to bear in mind when talking about the various Palestinian factions, and you named kind of the two big ones. You have Hamas, which has been ruling Gaza for the past 16 years, and you have the PLO, which rules the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza have not had the opportunity to vote for their representatives since 2006. So, you compare with Israel, which has had I don't even know how many elections in the span of a year. They've had quite a few. They, get the chance to exercise their ability and right to vote all the time. Palestinians, kind of the opposite. And so I think that's just kind of an important thing to state. So, when people kind of go off of the Palestinians support X, Y, and Z, it's actually, no, Palestinians aren't really often given the opportunity to vote. And certainly, I would argue that the options for them, the options that are put forward to them are simply not great. I mean, on the one hand, you have Hamas, which kind of goes without saying, committed this obscene attack on October 7th, and which as a result, the war that has erupted has, first and foremost, the biggest victims of it have been the Palestinian people living in Gaza. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, you have the Palestinian Authority, which are widely regarded, and with kind of good reason, by the Palestinian people living there as subcontractors of Israeli occupation. They have security coordination with Israel. They're the ones that are kind of keeping the lid on any sort of any issues, any sort of resistance to that, peaceful or otherwise. The PLO is not this bastion of democracy. I think with regard to, certainly with Hamas and its charter, which you mentioned, I mean, I think what's interesting reading, I went back to there because they kind of published a sort of revamped version of their charter in 2017. And as you know, they're abjectly opposed to Israel and to Zionism, which they regard as a colonial project, a colonial entity. But actually, the group also states in its latest charter that it considers the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital along the 1967 lines, with the return of refugees, to be a formula of national consensus. So weirdly, that updated charter kind of made headlines because it was seen to be okay, but we'll back a two-state solution, but we really don't like Israel, but we're going to do this anyway. Obviously, you can very rightly question its commitment to that, given the events of October 7th. But I think the reason that I was saying that, in the eyes of some, Hamas is kind of the only game in town is because, look, the PLO is kind of languishing in the West Bank. People living in the West Bank, living under brutal military occupation, they kind of have no hope for the future. Meanwhile, Hamas, despite the fact that obviously Israel has spent 2 months trying to eradicate Hamas, and yet at the same time, Hamas has kind of succeeded in bringing a lot of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, many of them women and children, home. So I think that's the danger there. Israel has set out on this war of eradicating Hamas. They haven't been able to do that, apparently, in 2 months' time, and are now moving south. Have managed to kill a lot of civilians in the process, and unfortunately, Hamas is, if nothing else, is seen to have put the Palestinian issue back on the map and is getting Palestinian prisoners out of jail. So, it's this question of approach. I feel like I kind of went all over the place, but I think that's kind of where we are with sort of what options the Palestinians have. And frankly, there's just not a lot of good ones.
Hugo, I mean, there are jihadist cells in the forces fighting Israel. Israel's religious Zionist wing is partly driving the campaign. There's a huge, religious right wing within Israel. But you actually think there's comparatively little religious narrative within this?
Yeah, I mean, look, Zionism was not a religious project. It was not a project of religious nationalism. It was a project of ethnic nationalism. It was a project designed to normalize the Jewish experience. There's this fantastic quote, often attributed to Ben Gurion, but I think it was actually an Israeli poet whose name I forget, who said, "We'll know that Zionism has succeeded when Jewish policemen arrest Jewish prostitutes and throw them in Jewish jails." Which is not a religious quest. It's about the idea behind Zionism is a country where Jews can be normal as Jews.
Yeah.
Right. That said, yes, of course, there is a religious religious aspect to this, a lot of, not all of, but a lot of the settler movement, and there are elements of support from the American Christian religious right. That's there, but it's not the motivation for this conflict. It's not the motivation for Israel, for even most Israeli expansionism. By the same token, there's this sort of Israeli narrative that the whole problem with that they have with the Palestinians is the dominance of Islamist militants in Palestinian society. I think we all know that even if Hamas wasn't running Gaza, things would not be all peace and light in the Holy Land. So, while yes, of course, there are religious elements that creep in, but it's not fundamentally a religious conflict. Nor when it's seen, when it is sort of mapped out on British streets in terms of protests, is it fundamentally a religious dispute. Anti-Semitism isn't religious prejudice. Most anti-Semites know next to nothing about Judaism and care less. I'm not sure if this is quite right, but I've sometimes wondered if that's one of the things that distinguishes anti-Semitism from Islamophobia. That when Islamophobes attack Muslims, they often do so on the basis of what Muslims are purported to believe or want to do or are supposed to do in a religious context. None of that stuff really happens with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a much purer sort of racism, a much purer sort of hate. And so I think there's almost an extent to it when we talk about this as a religious conflict. What we're doing is we're sort of we're ascribing motives to all parties that aren't quite there. This is a sort of sectarian dispute, I think, rather, and of course in Israel it's and Gaza itself a territorial dispute. But I think it's no more a religious dispute than the Iraq War was a religious dispute. Just because, admittedly, George Bush did call it a crusade, but still no more than the Bosnian War was a religious dispute. When I think you just have to see it in terms of groups of people with irreconcilable aims.
We did start off talking about how badly British politics does religion. Who do you think has handled this particular crisis well in Britain? I mean, I'm going to guess you're not going to say Suella Braverman for going all in on calling the demonstrations hate marches and encouraging the far right to go to the cenotaph. I
don't know. This will probably be contentious. I sort of think Keir Starmer's handled it fairly well. I don't really see what else he could have done, both with his sort of politics and the sort of general situation. I think he might feel at some point. I think he's going to be late to call for a ceasefire. Put it that way. I think because he's obviously not going to call for a ceasefire until Joe Biden calls for a ceasefire, and it would maybe benefit him if he could figure out exactly when that's going to happen and do it. A day and a half before would probably be preferable. I don't think he's quite going to manage that. I don't think Britain has generally handled this very well. And I think there's been a lot of projection across our politics about what's going on in a British sort of way. I've written only a little bit about this conflict. I've spoken about it more on radio. I found that most of I get a decent amount of anti-Semitic abuse online. I found that most of the abuse I've had have been from right-wing people who regard me as an apologist for immigration. And there's this notion that this is what happens when you let Muslims into Britain, and that's what you wanted to do, and now you're getting your just desserts. And what sort of frustrates me, apart from the effect to which that's just bollocks, is also... it's not a surprise to learn that Muslim communities and Jewish communities in Britain have differing views over the politics of Israel and Gaza. That's not new. That's not something that's leapt up on anyone as a shock in the last few months, the last month. What's been the surprise is the extent to which the center of gravity of British culture, certainly the left, which I've always regarded as being this great weight that drags us towards liberalism and tolerance and against discrimination and against prejudice, has seemed to show no interest in doing that when it comes to Jews. That's the thing. That's the thing that sort of upsets me. And I think there's very few people who've managed to grapple with that particularly well. And certainly none of the people you'd hope would have grappled with it on the left seem to be grappling with it.
Yeah. Ros, when we were talking about this before putting the podcast together, you were really interested in the episode with Kate Forbes and the SNP. That her religious views on gay marriage and similar were always going to damage her in her bid to be leader. And yet we now have a First Minister, Humza Yousaf, who can pray, he can conduct Islamic prayers in Boot House, and everybody's absolutely fine with that, and they should be absolutely fine with that. But the idea of, say, if Kate Forbes had got it and she was conducting Christian prayers in there, people would go, that's a bit weird. which is a double standard.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there are double standards here. I mean, Forbes's religion, which is quite an esoteric form of Protestantism, even by Scottish standards, was portrayed as reactionary. And, Hamza Yusuf, as we know, is also religious, but that was seen as progressive and modern. Rishi Sunak is a Hindu. No one comments on that. It's great no one comments on that. But at the same time, they are prepared to comment with Forbes. And I think we have to be a bit more subtle and nuanced about how we think about how politicians do religion, because clearly it's fine for them to do religion. I mean, Keir Starmer as well, he does Seder as well with his wife who's Jewish, and that's great. But we don't have a real sense of asking people, well, in this situation, how would your beliefs inform what you do? Because that would be very difficult if we were asking Rishi Sunak or Hamza Yusuf that question. And it's not something, but we need to be clearer about that distinction, because if we're going to be liberal and live in a liberal society, we have to be tolerant, as we are, of people with different religious beliefs. And that does include people who belong to quite esoteric Scottish Christian sects. I won't even say sect, because, it's a church. That makes it sound vaguely, weird and odd. It's a long-established church in Scotland. I think that kind of distinction between your public actions and your private belief gets harder and harder to sustain in an era where we're always encouraged to be performatively authentic and, do things like bring our whole self to work. You should never bring your whole self to work. Terrible idea.
Yeah.
No one should do that. You should be able to say, yeah, I believe this in my private life. For example, I don't personally like abortion, but I'm not going to try and ban it. That should be possible. And yet it's often greeted with a great deal of suspicion, depending on what on your priors about the person involved.
And this is kind of what effectively did for Tim Farron, isn't it? That he could not make the argument that his private beliefs are sort of non-negotiable because he is a Christian believer, and you can't, from his point of view, you can't go and pick and choose from what you're offered from, the set of beliefs that he subscribes to. And yet he said that wouldn't inform the way he governed, and was effectively kind of marked down because, well, then you're not being your true self, are you?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a difference between Hamza Yusuf and Kate Forbes. I think in that I'd have to check this, but I'm pretty sure Kate Forbes, because of her beliefs, did and would vote against equal marriage, and Hamza Yusuf, despite his beliefs, either didn't or abstained or made a point of abstaining. So I mean, there are different ways you can sort of navigate this, but you're quite right. I mean, Tim Farron basically did exactly what you're saying people should be able to do, and it's still I wouldn't say he was unfairly beaten up for it, but it did stick in the craw. You kind of thought this can't be real. Tony Blair was a Catholic eventually, and and he and he was a sort of ardent supporter of equal marriage. So I mean, it can be done, but
yeah, Boris Johnson is now a Catholic.
Is he?
So he had to be to marry Karen.
Promiscuous in all ways.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's not too late to add, and I think it kind of adds to this, but I can think of one MP who I think has done a particularly good job on this subject, but I think kind of also does a good job of balancing her identity with the politics, which is Lea Moran. I think in general she had a very principled response, had a lot of compassion, not just for British Jews, many of whom are among her constituents, but also for being half Palestinian herself and having family in Gaza who were sheltering in a church there. I think she's probably one of the few who I think just communicated with empathy and clarity. Kind of one of the few MPs. Her politicians I've seen really kind of everywhere communicate that in such a good way. In a way that I really didn't feel like she was both doing her job as an MP, making sure first and foremost that her constituents were okay and that she was responding to their needs, whilst also having this sort of principled position of, look, the Lib Dems think that this needs to be, or at least she was communicating this. I imagine it'd be a position that her party agrees with, of that this is why there needs to be a two-state solution, and from the embers of this nightmare, hopefully there will be some push to have a solution that ensures security and dignity for everyone living between the river and the sea. To use a phrase that has become very toxic, but if you approach it in that way, of everyone who's there stays and everyone is allowed to live there and have a full and happy life, as I certainly believe, then that's I think a way of both utilizing your background and the expertise that you might have with it, whilst also first and foremost doing your job, which is to be an MP.
Hugo, to wrap it up, the last census says that more people under 40 in England and Wales now identify as having no religion than say they're Christian. More than 50% of 20-somethings are not religious, compared to 37% a decade earlier. Is it possible that actually British politics has got it right? Just listen to Alistair Campbell, don't do God.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are not many less religious nations than Britain, and I'm sort of I think that's all to the good. While also thinking that I quite like the idea of people going to a place of worship once a week. I think it's generally good for them. It's generally good for communities. Yeah. I don't think it should have any role in our politics. I'm sort of 90s enough to not be able to separate the idea from creeping agnosticism from social progress generally. Yeah, I think that's probably all heading the right way.
Visit places of worship, but mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, quite.
Go to some other ones. The music's often very good and very interesting. So we've reached the end of the show, and it's time for escape routes. What artefacts of cultural importance are we nicking for our personal collective this week and not giving back? Ros?
Well, I was thinking of saying that I was playing badminton these days, but that's not an artifact of cultural importance. It's probably pretty much the most uncultural sport you can imagine. But anyway, no. What am I reading? I'm reading the latest novel by a French writer called Fred Vargas, who, despite her name, is female and is a fantastic French thriller writer. Really brilliant, and I love all her books. And she just came out with a new one, and this one has not yet been translated into English, but I'm sure it will be soon. But anyway, even a lot of the others have. And do try Fred Vargas. She's brilliant.
A fancy way of saying I can read books in French. Well done, Ros.
Sorry, guys. Sorry.
What's the new one called?
In French.
Can you translate, please, for the audience?
It's called On the Dolman, but I don't know if it's going to be translated as that.
That sounds extremely Asterix, the Gaul, on the Dolman.
It's set in Brittany, this one, so yeah.
Quite right. Yasmin, what's your escape route?
I've been deeply enmeshed in Israel-Gaza stuff, so I've needed lighthearted things, and I found it in the form of Soul, which was a 2020 Disney film, an animated fantasy.
It's a great picture. I love that film.
So good. It's exactly what I needed. I watched it last night.
Give the listeners a quick explanation of what happens.
So yeah, it's basically about this wannabe kind of jazz musician, a pianist, who effectively kind of, tell me if I'm describing this poorly, Andrew, but he kind of dies and goes to this sort of soul world where he sees where kind of all the souls are developed, and he desperately wants to get back to his body because he has like a gig that's going to be huge for his career that evening. But it's kind of this just wonderful tale of like what one's spark is, and what living life really means, and it's just so touching. I love it.
It's a belter. It's a bit of a weeper as well. So
yes, I cried.
Highly recommended. Yeah. Hugo, how about you?
I'm currently obsessed with Yellowstone. Has anyone seen Yellowstone?
No.
Yellowstone is it's known in the US as the Republican Succession, right? It's set on a ranch. It's the most preposterous program you've ever seen. It's set on a ranch. It's all about cowboys and cattle rearing and so on. Starring Kevin Costner as the patriarch and Kelly Riley as his sort of wayward daughter and various other people. It's not good, is the thing, but it's so sort of immersive. And I'm maybe 4 seasons in. It hasn't had any traction in this country for obvious reasons because it's so incredibly guns and Republicans. It's made by I think his name's is Taylor Sheridan. Is that what he called? Hold on, I've got it written down. It's made by Taylor Sheridan, who also made Hell or High Water, if you ever saw that. So he's a very sort of I don't know how you'd put it, sort of red state, sort of gun-toting type filmmaker. But what I love about it is the longer it goes on, and I'm now in like series 4 or perhaps 5, the more kind of self-indulgent it it becomes. And quite a lot of the episodes star Taylor Sheridan himself doing like riding around on a horse and lassoing cattle, and it's just completely mesmeric. I'm completely sucked in by it.
So it's like an Old Spice commercial with a plot.
Yeah, but then it's also like really sort of quite sort of violent in a quite crap way. So they're always shooting each other. There's a lot of guns and no sex, basically.
Oh, right.
A lot of violence, a lot of murder, no sex. It's just very upstanding, very white, except for the Native Americans.
Lots of people standing their ground.
Lots of people standing their ground, and it's all about how Antifa is coming from Montana, and they must be fought.
Antifa don't know where Montana is.
Well, there you go. It's basically, it's all about how sort of reactionary white America has to stand its ground against the Native Americans who want to take their land. I suppose there's an element of that there. But it gets sort of quite mesmeric and magical, like watching somebody fly fishing eventually.
Okay, all right. Well, whatever floats your boat. Well,
There you go.
Listeners will be unsurprised to learn that I'm watching liberal woke fantasy Doctor Who, which is back, and has become really, really good again. The last episode, Wild Blue Yonder, was absolutely astonishing, terrifying, strange, verge of the edge of reality strangeness on the go. But what I particularly enjoyed is not all, but some of the way in ways in which Russell T Davies has been winding up the anti-woke mob, particularly by casting an Asian actor as Isaac Newton, which has had certain chunks of social media absolutely losing their shit. How dare you do this? Isaac Newton wasn't an Asian bloke. Well, I've got news for you. Queen Victoria wasn't a werewolf, and Churchill didn't have a pet Dalek, and it's a fun, made-up science fiction adventure show. It doesn't matter if they've got a brown Isaac Newton, and it doesn't matter that he thinks the thing that's holding us all to the earth is called Mavity. Doesn't matter at all. Anyway, that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Yasmin.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Ros.
Thank you.
And thank you, Hugo.
Always a pleasure.
Oh God, What Now will be back on Friday or Thursday if you're a Patreon backer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.